Ashkenazi background, and you know, growing up in Israel, we don't have the term politically correct. It's kind of a term that Israelis don't know. You know, we're so pushy and stuff. So when I was growing up, the first question that kids would ask me when I would come to a new class or school was, what are you? And I was like, what do you mean, what am I? And they were like, are you Ashkenazi or Sephardic? Now, how many of you are Sephardic here? Anyone?
Me.
and who are you? Who of you are Ashkenazi?
Me.
Well, it's interesting because
You're Sephardic?
Interesting because I think that today, you know, it doesn't really have a lot of implications to be either Ashkenazi or Sephardic unless you're very religious, and the way you daven might be a bit different. But other than that, I think that in Israel, most people ask about it is because Ashkenazi have their certain kind of foods and music and culture, whereas Sephardic is a much more wider range of different ethnics, different musics and different foods. And they always say that Sephardics have better food. So they want to know what kind of Sephardic am I? Am I Moroccan, Iraqi, or whatever? So it's interesting. But I think that you know, we were just playing Jewish geography here, right? And we found out that what's your name again?
David.
David. That David actually has been to the very small community that my parents are from, and most Israelis don't even know it. So you know, like you play here Jewish geography in Israel, we would play, what kind of Sephardic or Ashkenazi are you? But I think that growing up in Israel, I was very much raised on the, how would I call it, the Zionist dream of kibbutz galuyot. Kibbutz galuyot means to bring all Jews together from all over the world to Israel. And I took great pride in it because my father's family originates in Europe. His father came from the Ukraine. His mother came from Poland. His father was a farmer. He was a pioneer in Israel. He was a farmer until he retired. And my mother's family comes from Iraq. And so I had great pride, and you know, I was the fulfillment of the Zionist dream. I have my family come from all over the world to Israel. And it was only years later when I realized, actually only in high school, I guess, that this narrative is not really my narrative. And you know, in Israel we say that we are a pattern of our society or our country. And that means is that we are, our identity is actually comprised of the different people we meet and the different cultures that we kind of absorb into us. And a lot of the times I try to ask myself, what is my identity? Let's say that no one was around me here. What is my identity? What is my narrative? And I guess that I felt a lot of the times that the narrative I was raised on of being Zionist and you know, having everyone come together was kind of imposed on me in a way. And in 2003, I was almost graduating from high school, and I remember the Americans invaded to Iraq. Now you have to understand, my mother almost hardly ever spoke about her past. So on the one hand, I was brought up on this very Zionist narrative, but on the other hand, it was lacking a lot of content because my father didn't know much about his family from Europe, and my mother didn't want to speak about her past. And in 2003, she kind of realized that this was her chance to go back to Iraq now that she's going to have this opportunity. And then she really started looking back into her past and trying to see what happened. You know, in Israel, an ole, being an immigrant to Israel, means to go up. It's a very positive status. It's a status of pride to be an ole. Whereas a refugee has negative connotations to that because it's a bit like being an underdog. And a lot of the Jewish refugees I was talking about who came from Muslim countries didn't label themselves as refugees, and also the country had no intention of doing that because, you know, Israel built itself on bringing Jews from all over the world because of ideological reasons. And if they came to Israel because they wanted to come there, then they can't be refugees. And also because all these people who came from these countries wanted to portray themselves in a positive way, you know. I made Aliyah. I came to Israel because I wanted to fulfill the Zionist dream. Almost about the same amount of people And when the Palestinians are calling for the right of return, Israel can say, well, listen, we also have close to 1 million Jews that we absorbed from these Muslim countries, and they're not calling themselves refugees, they're not claiming for any rights, and the Muslim countries are not going to take them back. So we kind of settle this dispute among us if we say that we already absorbed 1 million people, and you're not going to take them back, so you can't come back here. So once it was in a political context, it was kind of settled. And I think this really kind of shattered my perception of the Zionist dream. Because suddenly, all these people who were olim, who gave all that sense of pride, were now refugees. And that was kind of hard to take in. And the film, actually, the name of the film is Shadow in Baghdad, and it's actually stated on top of the flyers that we put on the chairs. I'm going to get back to that later. But in a sense, I felt that my mother's story also sheds a shadow on me. Because I didn't know what the past was. I didn't know what is the story of my family. And in a way, it was only when she started to look back into it that I discovered what it was. So in 2003, when my mother was investigating her past, she started writing columns in Arabic newspapers in the Arab world. And apparently, a Muslim journalist from Iraq read her column and somehow contacted her on Skype. And he said that he had read her story and he had read about her father and that he wants to help her find out. So a bit of a background about what my mother's story is. My mother was born in Iraq in 1950, and the Jewish community of Iraq dates back 2,500 years ago. It's one of the most ancient Jewish communities worldwide. And this community was a very prestigious community with a very rich history that in a way ceased to exist in no time. I mean, in 1949, there were 130,000 Jews living in Iraq, and the Jews actually comprised 1/4 of the population in Baghdad. And they were very much integrated in society. They had leading positions. They were lawyers and doctors and had official government positions. And actually, my mother's father was a very prominent lawyer in Iraq. Now, things started deteriorating in terms of the attitude the Jews received in the 40s when the Nazis came closer with Iraq, and it also had a negative effect on the Jews there. And it started deteriorating when the British left Iraq. And then in 1949, things got to the most high extent after Israel was established and Jews were said bye-bye. I mean, you're not wanted here any longer, and you will give you, very few things to take with you, but you have to leave. Now, my mother's father at the time had a very successful career in Iraq, and he was a very proud Iraqi man who believed that this turmoil will reside in time, and that Jews will live again a very full and rich life in Iraq. So when most of my mother's family left Iraq in 1949, my mother's small family was one of the very few families to stay in Iraq. A few thousand Jews stayed in Baghdad at that time. What am I going to show you now actually portrays a bit of that history, but also the story of my mother in particular. And I think it actually sums up in a way my point for this talk that I'm later going to elaborate on, is that how do we build our narrative? How do we build our identity? Is our identity our story? Is it comprised of narratives that we kind of take from different narratives that are in society? I mean, if it's good to be an ole, then I want to be an ole, and when it's not, I want to be a refugee. How do I portray what my story is, what my narrative is, what my identity is? And I think that it's very important because a lot of the times when we don't have the details, we have a hard time kind of building our own personal narrative. So the story of Shadow in Baghdad actually follows the relationship that develops between the Muslim Iraqi journalist, who was actually very young. He actually was born after my mother's father was kidnapped in Iraq, and it actually tells the story